Alrighty, in this video, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and put together a really simple, straightforward web page, just so we can see a sort of real-world example of where we would be using some of Less's most important and time-saving features. So we're not going to look at all the features of Less, obviously. There's great documentation, as is there on most of the tools we've been talking about, but we will see a real-world sort of use of how we might put an application together, or how we might style an application using Less. So these features I'm going to show you are basically the absolute most important things you're going to want to work with, and you're going to immediately see how working with Less is significantly more productive than working with vanilla CSS. Also, if you're more interested in going off and doing Sass, pretty much all the features I'm going to show here are very similar to features in Sass that have a similar syntax, might be a little bit different, but the concepts are the same. So if you just want to work through this, you'll get a good idea about the basic concepts, and if you want to go learn the Sass syntax, you can head over to their site. Anyway, so basically that's what we're going to be putting together, just a really simple little single page here, and so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to talk about, this is just basically an aside. I didn't know where to exactly put this in this demonstration, but it's really straightforward, and it should come as a breath of fresh air for you guys who are used to working in CSS, and that is single line comments. So that is really nice. Only certain particularly old browsers that shall not be named will not throw an error at a single line comment in CSS, but Less supports them just fine. I mean, obviously it also supports your standard multi-line comments as well. You'll see an interesting behavior with this though. If I come over here to my O1 example folder and I run npm run, what did I call that, styles. And if you go take a look at the compiled site.css, you'll notice the single line comment disappeared and only the multi-line comment remained. Just an interesting aside, it doesn't really affect anything, because as you'll see later when we're talking about Less, we're not going to have to worry about looking at this for debugging purposes, looking at the compiled CSS for debugging purposes. There's another way to do it. Anyway, let's start off with one of the simplest and most fundamental features of Less that is incredibly important, and another thing that you should immediately right off the bat see the value of, and that is variables. So in Less, I can declare a variable by starting with the @ symbol, and let's call this guy page width. Notice that I can create variable names with dashes in them, and then I'm going to apply a colon, and I'm going to provide a value. So the value here in a Less variable is just more important than a search and replace sort of thing. Values in Less variables actually have types, different types. In CSS we have different kinds of things we can put attributes in. For example, like our height expects some sort of number here. In this case, we're using 100%. Or a color might accept, or a background might accept a color, or a font might accept a list of tokens for which fonts to use. So it's important to understand that in Less, the type of the variable is actually significant, and it plays a role in certain ways that you can use that variable down the line. And we'll talk about that a little later when we talk about functions. But anyway, so let's go ahead and, so that I'm not jumping around everywhere, I'm going to declare all of the variables I'm going to use in this example right here, right now. So the next variable I'm going to use is background, and for this guy, I'm just going to go ahead and do 1E, 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 and we get a nice little very dark gray. Then I'm going to go ahead and do a font color. Font color is when I do a dark website, I usually like having most of my font colors kind of muted, kind of like how you can see here in the Solution Explorer. It's not pure white, so I'm going to do a very light gray, which is going to be C8, 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 and that'll look really nice. And then I'm going to do I'm just going to do a color accent, and the accent is going to be 007ACC, and that's a nice little blue color. And it's not this is an accent. You'll see that nice little blue color all over Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. I just happen to really like that color. And then I'll go ahead and do a font family. So this will be an interesting other example of another type of variable you can do. In this case, a list of fonts. So I'm going to do Verdana and Arial as the fallback there. Okay, so how do we use variables? Well, it's actually really straightforward. I guess I can go ahead and first of all, I'm going to go ahead and run that, And then I'm going to expand this. I'm going to split this, and I'm going to open up the compiled code so that we can see the compiled code along with the less code as we're working. Notice how it didn't output anything, obviously because, you know, CSS does not have variables. So let's see how we can use them. I'm going to go ahead and open up my body, and I'm going to do background of background. And so you'll see right here that the way that we reference a variable is very similar to how we declare it. We simply use @ followed by the variable name. Very, very, very straightforward. And we can do the same with color. We can say color is font color. We can go ahead and do the same with our font family. I can say font family is font, family. And font size, I'm just going to hard code this to 12 pixels. Then, so yeah, so that's our body. Let's go ahead and jump back here, run our styles. And we now see we have our body. But before we move on, let's go ahead and build up our HTML page first. So now we have some actual styles that we can see being rendered onto our example page. Let's just get the skeleton out of the way, because it's actually going to be it's going to be a really simple HTML file. So let's go ahead and write that real fast. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over to my Solution Explorer, and I'm going to go ahead and hit New File. I'm going to create an index.html. And inside the index, I'm just going to go ahead and just write out a really simple HTML file. Obviously, the first thing we're going to start off with is our doc type. Always make sure you put your doc type in, so we mark this as being HTML5. Then I'm going to go ahead and do HTML greater than head plus body and hit tab. And so some of your editors may have that feature, some might not. If you don't, go ahead and write this in manually. And I'll throw in a title here and call this example website. And then I'm going to go ahead and include my CSS file inside of the head element. So to do that, I'm going to do link rel equals style sheet, type is text CSS, and href is going to be site.css. And then I'll go ahead and hit tab to autocomplete that for me. All right, so now I have my head done. So let's go ahead and work on the body. So for the body, we're going to have 3 primary elements: our header, our body, and our footer. And they're all going to be wrapped in an element called site wrap. So I'm going to do dot site wrap, and then I'm going to do dot header and hit tab. Then inside of here, I'm going to open up the header element, the header HTML5 element. I'll create an H1, and we'll call this example, and then I'll open up a strong element and say website, so we can accent that website color. Then I'm going to do a nav. So to do the nav, I'm going to say nav greater than a times 4, so that I get 4 anchor tags. And I'm going to go ahead and hit tab. So all the hrefs are going to be hash. And the first one is going to be home. Second one will have an href of hash. Then it'll be about hash, and then contact hash, and then blog. So that is our navigation. All right, so that's our header, actually. So let's go ahead and do our body. So I'm going to do site wrap dot body and then greater than section, so that we get our section element completed in. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up a p tag, a paragraph element, and I'm going to type in lorem, and then I'm going to hit tab. So if you're familiar, a lorem ipsum is just a standard placeholder text that's used in design when you don't have anything to actually type. You're free to go ahead and type whatever you want in here. If you don't have an editor that'll autocomplete lorem, just hop online, type in lorem ipsum on Google, and you'll get a billion different websites that'll generate this text for you that you can just copy and paste in. I'm going to do this one more time to give us 2 paragraphs, kind of fill out the body just a little bit. All right, that's our body. Let's go ahead and do our footer. So footer is simply going to be site-wrap.footer greater than footer. And so now we have this. And then inside the footer, I'm just going to do the copy, so the little copyright symbol, HTML entity. And I'm going to do 2015-Nelson Lackey. You can obviously put in whatever you want here. But anyway, now that we have this done, let's go ahead and serve it up. So I'm going to use the HTTP server that we installed in one of the earlier videos in this series. If you don't have the HTTP server node package installed globally, of course, the command is going to be npm install http-server -g for global. But I've already done that on my system, so that's now available for me to execute. I'm not going to execute it in this command window. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and say start cmd. Of course, the start cmd command is only going to work on Windows, but all it did is it popped open another command line window to this directory. If you're on Linux or Mac OS, be sure to open up a second terminal and navigate to this directory. Then I'm going to type in http-server and hit enter. So all that's going to do is it's going to serve out all of the static files in this directory on the following addresses. All right, so I'm going to move this off the side. We won't be needing to look at this anymore. But do keep it running, because if you close it, you're no longer going to be able to access this HTML file. Now, of course, you don't need to use HTTP server. You could just pop open the HTML file yourself off your file system, but it's up to you. Anyway, I'm going to keep this HTML file open for just a quick sec for you guys if you want to pause it to take a look at it, because after this, we're not really going to look at this HTML file anymore. And while you're doing that, I'm going to hop over and I'm going to load this up in Chrome. So now we see here, we have our example website with our navigation and our body and our footer. And obviously it's the only styles we have are the head and the body, or the background and the font color and the font itself. So now let's hop back in here and open up site.css. Whoops, site.less. Be sure that you're not editing site.css. Be sure that you're editing site.less. And yes, it is possible and actually preferred for you to separate your .css and .less files away from each other in different folders. We're not going to look at that in this video, but we'll definitely see examples of that when we start using Gulp. Alrighty. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and separate these out to columns. So as you saw before in the example, we have our header up here, we have our body, which is taking up all of this space, as you can see here. It's taking up all the space here, and then we have our footer at the bottom. I'm going to use the Flexbox in order to do this. So let's hop over into our code and open up our less file. And right here, for our body, I'm going to say display is going to be flex, and then I'm going to say flex direction is column. So if we do that, make sure we come back here and type in npm run styles so that we compile our CSS. So make sure your CSS is compiled. Then hop back over here and hit F5, and you'll see no difference. And the reason for that is that we haven't instructed the Flexbox to force the body to grow to fill as much space as it can. So there's a couple ways we can write this rule. So I basically need to give the body element a particular flex property. And what you could do is you could certainly say body greater than, let's say, site wrap.body. And then I could specify my parameter here, which is, in this case, flex grow 1. Let's go ahead and compile that. I really am running out of screen space here. Jump over here and hit reload, and now our footer is all the way at the bottom of the page because now the body takes up all the remaining space in this column. But there's a better way to do it, and this is actually going to be the second most important aspect of less after variables. So variables are very important. Another really ridiculously important and time-saving thing is we can actually write this rule underneath the body rule. We can nest our rules. So as you see right here, this is just a secondary rule that works off body, but what if I wanted to nest this rule inside of body? I can come down here, and I'm just going to say greater than site wrap body flex grow 1. Literally the exact same. This rule is the exact same as this. This is nested into body. Now, the immediate descendant selector is not required. I could do site wrap body and it will still make a nested rule, but I want this in here because I want to specify that only the site wrap body that is an immediate descendant of body should be selected for this particular style. So again, this is equivalent to this, and you can nest as much as you want to. We're going to see a lot of examples of nesting in the rest of this video, so I'm not going to worry about talking about it any much more, except I will go ahead and run this. I'll compile this to prove to you guys that if we hop over to site.css, so now this style got added in right there. Because obviously straight up CSS doesn't support nested styles. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is let's see another example of nested rules. Notice how these sections are taking up 100% of the browser. I don't want that. As you saw before in the example, you'll notice that they are centered. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to hop down here after body, and I'm going to go ahead and say, well, no, inside of body, derp. I'm going to say site-wrap, and then I'm going to open up another inner select or nested rule. I'm going to say greater than header, greater than section, greater than footer, And then I'm going to say max width is page width. Remember that variable up here that's set to 700 pixels? And then I'm going to say margin is auto. So here's an example of, I have a nested rule inside a body, which uses the immediate descendant selector on site wrap. And then inside of the site wrap, I have 3 other immediate descendant selectors here. By adding the comma, I can declare multiple selectors in the same rule set. And here I'm grabbing header, section, and footer. That's an immediate child of site wrap. As you see, remember in our index.html, each one of our site wraps has a header, section, or footer, and that's the one we want to select to constrain the width and center. So coming back here, let's go ahead and compile it and see what happens. Once we compile it, notice over here what we got on our CSS. So again, all of this super redundant code is no longer required unless because of the of nested rules. And now if I hop back over here into Chrome and hit F5, notice how as I drag it up or to the right, notice how these elements are now centered. All 3 of them are. Alrighty, there's one more thing I want to do in this video, and that is talking about imports. So importing in less is basically the ability to be able to, well, import another less file into our existing less file, but it doesn't work like normal CSS imports. I mean, you can have it work with them by specifying import options, but in general, when you import another less file, it's basically like requiring or including that less file into the main less file so that it's not an external resource. Whereas in CSS, when you do an import, the browser will actually go off and make a request to another CSS file. But with less, it'll concatenate everything into the same file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to the bottom of site.less, and I'm going to import 4 files. And these files don't exist yet, but they will. We'll create them here in a second. I'm going to say @import, which is the same syntax as you would see in a CSS import. I'm going to say styles mixins. Then I'm going to import styles header. And then I'm going to import styles body. And then I'm going to import styles footer. So I'm just separating out things like this. So this is a very common thing that you'll do when you have a CSS preprocessor like less or Sass. You will break all your individual parts of your application into different CSS files that you can kind of include at the bottom or at the top or whatever of your primary less file. And it's a great way to sort of modularize your code. Anyway, let's go ahead and create that. All these files. I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm going to call this styles. I almost called that folder. And in styles, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it mixins.less. Now, don't worry about what mixins are. We will talk about that later. But I like separating my mixins out into their own file. We'll see an example of that later again, though. I'm going to go ahead and create another file called header.less, and another file called footer.less, and another file called body.less. So now I have all 4 of these files being included. So if I hop back into site.less, notice that I do not have an extension here. Now I could put a .less extension here on the import if I wanted to, but it's not required. The less engine will properly resolve this as a relative path to our current directory. So let's go ahead and prove that. I'll go ahead and put in just a bogus thing in header. I'll just say .ble, so a class selector on ble, color blue. Just a bogus thing in header, just to show you guys that header.less is indeed being imported. Let's hop back over into our command line and run our styles again to compile them. And now let's hop into site.css. And now we see all of the stuff that was in site.less at the top, but down here where we imported header.less, it got dumped in right in here into our compiled CSS file. Now, a great thing about imports is that we can actually use the variables that we declare up here in site.less in the less files that we've imported. And we're going to take huge advantage of that. But anyway, I think that's about it for this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one while we continue our awesome investigation of less. So see you then.